I love when someone takes all of their expertise, all of their knowledge, all of the things that they know they're good at, and they put it to a different part of their world, and they're willing to learn and to accept something new. So often we're a bit like the old dog who won't learn new tricks, right? We're not willing to hear or understand. The story you're going to hear today from Jim Warner Wallace, J. Warner Wallace, is the author of Cold Case Christianity. He's a man who has been a detective for many, many decades, in fact, a homicide detective, and then started putting those same principles, those same ideas to what it means to say, hey, is this Christian story actually true? J. Warner Wallace has written a host of books, including Cold Case Christianity, and runs podcasts. He's done Forensic Faith. There's a book, a person of interest. There's a heap as well, and he has been very kind to join us now. It's so wonderful to have you on board, and let's have this conversation a bit around part of your story first, because I know that you're aware, and certainly we're aware that there are people who are listening right now who some would say, look, I have a very deep faith in Jesus, and so I want to learn more about how I can help people understand that there is good evidence and truth. And there's others who are perhaps go, well, I'm not even sure about that, but I don't mind listening to your radio station. Let's talk a bit about your story, because it sort of encapsulates a bit of both of those. Were you always wanting to be a police officer sort of growing up?
I think you're right about it kind of capturing both sides of that equation. I think I've been in both chairs, but I wasn't really all that committed to the idea of being a cop growing up. My dad was a police officer, though, and I saw him work, and I always thought his work was important. He was a detective. He worked homicides. So I kind of watched that in my younger years, but my gift set was a little bit different. I kind of felt like I was more interested in the arts, so I ended up pursuing a bachelor's degree in design and then a master's degree in architecture, and I was working as an architect in a city here in Southern California called Santa Monica. And I was in my late 20s when I decided, maybe it would be, I just thought that of the two possible careers, one in which I was already employed, and the other one that my dad had been employed in for so many years, I just kind of felt like that his career might provide me a more stable kind of way to raise a family, to be honest with you. The arts here, at least at that time, were kind of chaotic, and I could see myself being a complete workaholic and never being home, because it feels like if you could just spend 20 more hours this week on this project, it would be a much better design. Well, that would have been me. So I kind of felt like in order to rein that in, and I watched my dad raise his second family with, and I thought, well, it's a noble calling, all of that stuff. I was not a believer at the time. I wasn't a Christian for nearly another 10 years. But I kind of felt like, well, this was an important job, and it's amazing how many cops end up drawing their kids into law enforcement. I mean, it's one of those. It is kind of magnetic. You kind of watch your dad do it, and before long, you find yourself wearing the same uniform.
Yeah. You ended up in homicide and being a detective in that area as well. I would imagine, for anybody, is a stressful job. It's a job that you have to work very hard to not carry things and carry other parts of it. Did you find that this was a job that you realized, hey, look, I'm sort of made for this?
When I was younger, watching him, he would share his cases with me sometimes. When I was a teenager, he brought me into the station one night and showed me this case he had been working on, and I watched the video. And at that time, it was all film. They would roll this 8mm film, and I thought I could never do this. I had to have him turn it off about halfway through. I just couldn't. I thought, how does anybody, muddle through these horrific death scenes? This was a particular murder where 4 people were killed, and he was showing me the film, and I just thought, it's not for me. But by the time you get into it, and after you've been to so many of these calls, you do sadly get desensitized a little bit, and you feel like, hey, there's a job to be done. I'm going to have to disconnect from all of this in order to do it. So it never really posed a problem for me. I always tell people that in order to do this kind of work, you have to draw a really tight circle around the people for whom you're willing to cry. And that needs to be so tight for me. It was my wife, my kids, and probably my dog.
Yeah.
Anybody else was not in that circle. So that meant if somebody, sadly, if my nephew had been murdered, I could have worked that case, because I wasn't going to allow anybody beyond my own kids in that circle. And you have to, because there's going to be times when you're going to get called to a murder of a child. And if you're going to start to kind of overthink this, you're not going to be able to work that case. And somebody has to work it. And at the same time, I didn't want it to destroy me. So I think what you do is now look, as a Christian, and I became a Christian later, it is a more difficult task because, we're called to open up that circle, to even include our enemies. So now what do you do? So that tug of war, I think, is more difficult later. I think what happens later, though, is you understand what is the nature of life. Are we really just temporal creatures that have hopefully get 90 years, and if you get less than 90, that's a bummer? Or is there a life beyond the grave? I mean, these are things you have to think through, and as you think through them, it does help you to work homicides.
Yeah. Let's talk about how you did end up approaching Christianity, and it was very much, and in fact, a lot of the work that you now do, I've got my Cold Case Christianity book with me, and I've been reading through it, and I've had it for many years as well. The idea is, you decided, look, hey, I'd been a devout atheist, I suppose would be probably the fair description, and you'd actually, my understanding too, Jim, you had a good crack at anyone who was Christian in the previously. So how did you eventually approach Christianity, using, I suppose, some of those detective skills?
Well, look, it's not. It's not that the cold case skills are necessarily that important. If you've worked robberies, if you've worked burglars, if you've worked any crime in which there are a number of witnesses that have to be interviewed, that does give you a certain sense about how to evaluate eyewitness testimony. What does it look like? Why would I even think it is eyewitness testimony? And what are the criteria by which we're going to put this case in front of a jury and ask the jury to evaluate these eyewitnesses? Well, look, that's kind of the way you're thinking from the very beginning. And I walked into a church with my wife. She was interested in thinking about, what should we raise our kids? The kids are going to get old enough to where it's going to be too late at some point if we don't start bringing them to church. Should we bring them to church? I thought there's no need for that. I was not raised around Christians. No one in my family was a Christian. I didn't think it was really necessary, but I also was the kind of person who would be more than happy to do whatever made my wife happy. So if you want to go, I can go as a non-believer. And I think it's ridiculous, and the Christians that I had met were pretty easy to defeat. That they didn't seem like they were well prepared. They didn't seem to evaluate this as though it was a claim about reality. I mean, if I pushed back a little bit, they would collapse. The few people I knew at work who were Christians were not really gifted at defending what they believed, and I thought, these are people who make cases for a living. You're telling me you're not going to apply that same approach to your spiritual beliefs? I just thought it was ridiculous. And so I walked into this church, though, because she had been asking me to go for about 3 years. And so I finally walked in, and the pastor kind of pitched Jesus in a way that I could catch him. He said that Jesus was smart. As a matter of fact, he said it was the smartest man who ever lived. And I thought, well, I could accept, I think, the idea that there might be a fortune cookie Jesus that I could gain, sound bite wisdom from. And so that was my in. I thought, okay, I'll buy a Bible. So I bought a Bible, and I read through the Gospels, and really thinking it was just going to be proverbial statements, kind of like Proverbs, if you've ever read Scripture, kind of like Proverbs. But that it turns out it's a claim about a slice of history in the first century in a particular region of the known world in which a series of events allegedly occur that had been witnessed by people. Well, okay, that's pretty much like any case in the past, whether it's 30 years ago in a cold case or 3 hours ago in a fresh case or 3,000 years ago. I mean, to be honest, eyewitnesses are eyewitnesses. There's certain earmarks, certain kind of texture you're going to see, and there are ways to test these kinds of claims you would do in a criminal trial. And so I thought, well, this is the only way I know in. And what really provoked me was that when I read through the Gospels for the first time, is that they don't line up perfectly. In other words, they make claims that if you were to read them and not know much about the context or not know much about the people involved, you would say, well, they're contradictory in certain ways. And now I know from having worked cases that what appears to be contradictory is not always so, because no two eyewitnesses will ever agree on everything. I don't care if it happened just 10 minutes ago. If you separate those eyewitnesses, you'll get varying stories. Now, that's what you want to do. As a matter of fact, when I get called out to a murder scene, the first thing I do is ask the dispatcher to make sure the patrol officers separate the eyewitnesses, because if you don't, they will all tell you the same thing. And I don't want them to tell me the same thing. I want what appears to be a contradiction, because in the end it really isn't, and I'll be able to resolve it, and then I'll get a much fuller picture of what really happened, the nuances. Because let's face it, you and I, we have different interests. It's not just that we might be standing in a different location when the murder occurs. It's that you have a certain history and background and set of desires that's different than mine, and it causes you to filter things out, either consciously or unconsciously, and then report things that I might not report, because I'm not interested in that aspect of the scene. Maybe you're somebody, for example, who's been around a live fire situation, and you're calmer in the middle of a live fire. If you've got somebody who has military experience, for example, they usually will catch details that other people are simply trying to duck and are too busy flinching to be able to even notice. So there's lots of reasons why these reports seem to vary. And I'm just looking for those first, trying to understand who the witness is, and then puzzle this thing together. Well, when I saw the Gospels had that level of variation, something that I think a lot of skeptics would look at and say, well, there you go, we're done. Well, I looked at it and said, well, there you go, let's start. Because it turns out that's the way every set of eyewitnesses appears at first blush. And that's what I think got provoked me, to take the four criteria for reliable eyewitnesses that you see in the California state jury instructions and apply them to the Gospels, and that's what I started to do.
Yeah. I always know that you talk a lot about that concept of, and this sort of leads perfectly from there, of this sort of objective, facts or truth or evidence, and subjective facts and truth and evidence. Could you talk a bit more into that for us as well?
Well, okay, so the part of the problem is that in a culture where truth is a word that's kind of thrown around without being defined much, I think that's part of the problem, especially for jurors. We have to kind of discuss what the nature of truth is. Look, there are some claims that people make that are entirely based on their personal preferences and opinions. So if I told you, for example, that cheesecake is the best dessert, well, okay, that's my personal preference. That's it, because I, as the subject, make the claim true. This is called a subjective truth claim. The subject makes it true. On the other hand, if I said that isoniazid is the cure for tuberculosis, well, my opinion won't change that. I could have the opinion that whiskey is the cure for tuberculosis, but it wouldn't make it the cure, because that claim is made true not by the subject who holds it. It's made true by the nature of the object itself, in this case, isoniazid. In other words, that claim is made true by the object. We call that an objective truth claim rather than a subjective truth claim. So you can simply ask yourself, can I make it so? By simply changing my mind. If you can't, it's probably an objective claim. And some claims need to be separated in that sense. Is the claim that Christianity is true, or is the claim that God exists, for example? That simple claim, God exists. Is that claim a subjective claim, or is it an objective claim? And if you measure it this way, you can ask the question, well, can I make it so by simply changing my opinion? Because I believe it to be so, does that make God exist? Or if I said, because I don't believe it to be so, does that mean that God doesn't exist? Or is it that the claim itself is grounded in whether or not the object, God, exists? This is an objective claim about reality. Now, it may not be a true objective claim, because the only thing that's left to discover when you discover that something's an objective claim rather than a subjective opinion is it true or false? Because I can't tell you that it's false that you think cheesecake's the best dessert. That's your opinion. I can't argue with you about it. But an objective claim, like isoniazid is the cure, well, that's something we can argue about. It's either a true claim or a false claim. There are objectively false claims. Whiskey is the cure for tuberculosis is an objectively false claim. So for me, I needed to know, is this claim that Christianity is true? Is this a subjective claim grounded in what people hope for, or is it an objective claim? It turns out it's an objective claim, but it might be false. So that left me the last step in this, which was to do an investigation to determine if the claim was true or false.
Mm. And that process, and certainly, I reference Cold Case Christianity. There's a whole host of other books that you've written as well, Jim, that goes through very methodically, looking at the various places and spaces that you went through with that. So for those who perhaps we can't go through the whole book right now either, but from your perspective, once you went, all right, so this is now an objective claim. How did you go about saying, actually, I believe that this is true, and this is now an objective truth from what I'm seeing?
Yeah. So first of all, it comes down to this entire thing's going to come down to one claim, the claim of the resurrection. Lots of folks. Let's put it this way: we can argue about whether the textual evidence or there's enough manuscript evidence, or can we trust how the manuscript evidence was treated, blah blah blah. But to be honest, if the claims about Jesus in the first century were simply that he was an ancient rabbi who taught some things, preached some sermons, and none of the claims about Jesus included anything about miracles or being born of a virgin or having risen from the grave. In other words, if we took all of the supernatural stuff out of it and we said, here's the claim about Jesus, I doubt there will be a single scholar on the face of planet Earth who would doubt the veracity of Jesus of Nazareth based on the manuscript evidence. Because the manuscript evidence is more robust for this one figure in history than probably for any other historical figure. I mean, no one's been written about more than Jesus of Nazareth. But if you insert one miracle into the narrative, suddenly you can't trust any of it. And that exposes where the real issue is. The real issue is not in whether or not the manuscript evidence is sufficient to believe that he lived and did what he said. It's the fact that we have a bias against the supernatural. And so we can accept a natural Jesus who's just a guy, but we can't accept a supernatural Jesus who does anything miraculous. And this really comes down to our biases related to supernaturalism more than anything else. The first thing I needed to know is, do I have good reason to believe that how we experience the universe, what we see around us, requires more than just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry? Because under naturalism, all I need to account for everything I see is space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. Now, the problem I see, and I wrote about this in a book called God's Crime Scene, is that the major features we all acknowledge in the universe, that we live in a universe that has a beginning, for example, or that it appears to be fine-tuned for life, or that we have life that emerges from non-life in this universe. And then once it does emerge, it appears, at least, and this is not even that controversial, that it shows properties of design, even though naturalists would say it's not really design. But it does appear to be. It has characteristics that appear to be design. And the fact that we have consciousness and free agency, and we seem to be seeking a moral standard that transcends even any of us as a people group, and even the fact that we think some things are truly evil, meaning we require an objective standard of good in order to measure them. All of these features of the universe, we have to ask ourselves the question, can we explain those with just space-time, matter, physics, and chemistry? I actually don't think we can. And I think that the scientific world knows that and would just say, well, we can't explain it yet. Someday we might be able to, but yes, our theories about how a universe could pop into existence and how it could appear to be this fine-tuned in terms of all the cosmological constants, these are things we don't quite understand fully yet. Don't jump to God, though. Don't just jump, therefore God. Well, why are we doing therefore science? Therefore naturalism? I mean, it's a jump either way. The best inference we have right now is that something outside of space, time, and matter is the beginning of space, time, and matter. And that's not my claim as a theist. That's the claim of naturalists who hold to the to the Big Bang cosmology, the standard cosmological model, which is still accepted by more physicists than any other model. So the question then becomes, why am I clinging to my bias against the supernatural if I really require something outside of nature to explain so much of what we see inside of nature? Well, look, if there's if there's any miracle in the Bible that is really unbelievable, it's not in the New Testament. It's nothing that Jesus did. It's Genesis 1. Everything in the universe from nothing. Now, most of the standard cosmological model says this. So the question is, if this is a personal being rather than an impersonal force, then every miracle in the New Testament is a small potato miracle compared to everything in the universe from nothing in Genesis 1. If there's a being that can create everything from nothing, I'm inclined to think he can probably do whatever he wants with whatever he's created. He could probably walk on water. That would be a small potato miracle. And so that's why I just needed to first examine, like, what's keeping me from fairly evaluating the New Testament? Is it the manuscript evidence? Is it the criteria for reliable eyewitnesses? Or is it a bias that I have against anything supernatural? And I definitely was a philosophical naturalist when I first started. So I had to kind of work through those issues first.
Yeah. It's incredible, isn't it? J. Warner Wallace, he is the man behind a whole host of books in cold case Christianity, with a lot of the podcasts and books and all the things that he's been involved in, as we've been saying. If you've just joined us, as previously and still even now at various times a detective, and works a whole lot of different cases and has looked at Christianity. We're going to be back with Jim in just a couple of minutes' time as we continue this conversation and continue this understanding of why it's important to look at what the facts are. In fact, the back of Jim's book talks about you can believe because of the evidence, not in spite of it. And so often in society we've been told, oh, it's sort of the other way around with faith. We're going to dig into that a bit more with him next here on Towards Understanding.
Share your brand, your event, your message across 90 Christian radio stations and major cities in Australia and New Zealand by sponsoring Towards Understanding, hosted by Clayton Bielan. More than 210,000 people tune into Towards Understanding each week, and with just one sponsorship, you'll reach this immense engaged audience. Find out more about this exciting and unique opportunity now on the sponsorship page at positivemedia.com.au.
It is just such a privilege to be chatting to J. Warner Wallace, the man behind a whole lot of the Cold Case Christianity, whether it's the podcast, the books, and a whole host of other books as well, not called Cold Case Christianity, but he's written a heap of them as he's taken his skills and his heart and his passion as a detective and looked at the Christian faith, the Christian story, and looked at Jesus. We're just talking about this idea of the sort of cosmological argument as well, Jim, and this concept and the idea that says, well, actually, if God really created everything, and as you trace the moral argument and all these various arguments back to that, then some of these miracles in Jesus walking on water and whatever else it might be, well, that makes sense for a God to do that. Why do you think there is so much pushback against it? Because for many, many centuries, there wasn't as much a pushback, and I'm wondering if it sort of connects back to your conversations about truth and making sort of objective truth more subjective truth. We hear people say, well, that's my God, or that's what I believe about that. Are they connected? Is this why our current society is looking at things a bit differently?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, so I'm always hesitant to kind of point to any one thing too dramatically, because almost all of these things are much more nuanced, right? So for me, I had to evaluate these eyewitness claims, and in criminal trials we evaluate under 4 criteria. Was the witness really there to see what he said he saw? Can he be corroborated in some way? Has he changed his story over time? And finally, does he have a bias, a reason, a motivation to lie to me? So those are the criteria that I was evaluating the Gospels under. But I think what we see in culture now is a couple of things. Number one, what kept me out for a long time was that I really was raised in an entirely naturalistic view of the world, in which we really thought, in my life, in your life probably, we've seen so many scientific advances. I mean, if we couldn't do anything we're doing now in the information age not that long ago. It's happened that quickly. I also was raised in the generation that first stepped foot on the moon, that we thought we could conquer every single mystery in the universe. We would eventually know it's, I think what's happening, though, is just the opposite. I think that the more we drill down in trying to explain, for example, the origin of life, and recognize the complexity of the genetic code, for example, and the complexity of design at the molecular level, I think we have even bigger questions about how any set of natural processes could ever, in an unguided, I don't say unguided, but unsupervised way, produce the kind of complexity we see in biology or in a larger scale in the universe. I think that's the question is, number one, how committed are we to our naturalistic worldview? Do we reject supernaturalism? And let's face it, as history has progressed, because we learn things about the world around us, we pridefully think, well, then we're eventually going to know everything, instead of realistically thinking, well, actually, the more I know I don't know. Now, the second thing I think, though, is that, there's a point at which when we're in complete awe of the universe around us, that we submit humbly to the fact that we are finite creatures. I think the more we know about the universe, the more we think we are in control in some way. And the more we think that, and I think pride is a big issue of why, especially in a worldview that is centered on humility. This worldview is. Look, it turns out, of all of the things that could help you flourish as a human, the one that'll help you flourish the most, the one attribute that would change every metric of human flourishing, from how much you could learn and better grades and more income and more success at work and deeper relationships and a longer marriage, more or less a satisfying marriage, longer life, better physical health, better mental health. Well, the studies show us what this is. It's humility. And the studies have been going on for about 35 years. Humility is the one thing. This is, for example, if you're not a humble person, you can't be taught anything. People who demonstrate humility have much higher grades, do better on their exams for college. They learn at a faster rate. They are able, according to the studies, to discern truth from error at a higher rate. Why? Because they're humble enough to be taught. Now, there's the problem. As we become more and more prideful, we can't be taught anything. We think we know before you even open your mouth to tell us anything about anything. Now, it turns out that this aspect of humility is pretty hard to quell. Because if I told you, hey, humility would be to your advantage, well, you might say, well, how do I develop that? How do I chase that? How do I pursue that? You can't, because the pursuit of humility ends up making you very prideful. If I told you I'm a very humble person, you'd know I'm a liar, because you'd know that that's not what humility sounds like. You cannot pursue it that way. And it turns out that every worldview amplifies the pride that destroys humility. Why? Because every worldview is a doing worldview. Under atheism, it's meritocracy. It's you earn what you have to earn what you're going to get. And you get upset when somebody else gets a promotion that you think you deserve because you do certain things because you think that'll get you an education. You do these things because that'll get you the job. You do these things because that'll get you the spouse you're looking for. You do. Doing eventually leads to an elevation of pride because you look around and you say, I'm doing more than that guy. It's always comparative. So even under secularism, that's a worldview that doesn't do much to develop your humility. Now, every other theistic worldview is also a doing worldview. Got to do the 10 Commandments. Got to do the fourfold. Got to do the pillars of faith. Whatever it is, every single theistic worldview is I have to do these things to achieve the greatest or the highest goal of this theistic worldview, except for one. One says, no, actually, you could never really do anything to earn your salvation. That's something that has to be done for you. It's a free gift that God has to give you. And the only way you can receive it is to recognize that you can't do anything to earn it. You'd have to humbly bend your knee and recognize, number one, that there's a God and you're not him. And number two, that the way to achieve the greatest thing you could possibly, to be in the presence of this holy God, you'd have to first recognize that, do you really think you're going to impress a billionaire by pitching him a quarter? Probably not. You're probably going to have to bend your knee and accept the free gift. And this is a worldview that begins with humility, and then it extends humility to its furthest extreme, because Jesus says himself, I didn't come here to be served. I came here to serve. Mm-hmm. He flips everything. The last will be first. The first will be last. You want to live, you're going to have to give it all away. You're going to have. It's the exact opposite of the kind of doing worldview that we are kind of been raised in if you're a secularist. And this is the kind of thing that develops an attribute that happens coincidentally to lead to the highest level of flourishing, which is humility. Now, it could be a coincidence that the one worldview that begins and ends and leverages humility to its highest extreme happens to be the one worldview that will actually help you to flourish the most, and happens to be Christianity. Or it might be that worldview is the worldview of the designer, who knows best how the design was designed. And so for me, there's so many ways of cutting this. But in the end, I think what keeps us from wanting it is, number one, we want to be in control. Yeah. And two, we think that we're so smart, we've figured out that there's nothing outside of naturalism. There's nothing outside of what we can see and test and demonstrate for ourselves that is operating in the universe. And those are two things, I think, that keep us from God.
Mm. I want to ask two questions, because we sort of acknowledge that those who are listening today, fit in two broad camps. Those who may say, well, I do have a faith, and I do have a faith in Jesus, and I want to walk in that way, and I want to sort of put that group aside just for a moment. We'll get back for a question for them. But in light of what you're just sort of talking about too, for the group of those who might be listening and saying, well, look, I get that you're talking about this. This is starting to make a bit more sense. What's the key thing somebody might need to do to say, well, look, how do I actually go and do a test on Christianity myself? I've heard that conversation about humility. That makes sense. The philosophical, the concept of that idea. You've talked about some of these other areas, and I know that you're a big believer, Jim, too, in that people should go and do their own sort of work on it and look into it, not just necessarily accept what someone else has said. So what is the first place to start, and how do people actually do that best?
Well, I think a couple things. Number one, you have to have a template through which you can measure something. You can actually test something. So first of all, it starts by comprehensively reading the 4 accounts that claim to be eyewitness accounts. They just claim this. Doesn't mean they are. Now, here's what I would say about that. You have 4 Gospels. John and Matthew, I think, are easiest for us to understand. Okay, so John and Matthew. Okay, Matthew's a disciple. John's a disciple. So on their face, I can see, okay, these might be eyewitness accounts. But Luke will tell you he's not an eyewitness. Luke simply spoke to the eyewitnesses. Read the first paragraph of the Gospel of Luke. Now, this does not mean it's not an eyewitness account, because remember, when I open up a cold case, I might have 10 reports related to what eyewitnesses said, but they aren't written by the eyewitnesses. They're written by detectives who spoke to the eyewitnesses. Those are still supplemental reports that contain eyewitness accounts. So look at the Gospel of Luke as one of those. It's a supplemental report that contains the accounts of eyewitnesses and servants of the word according to Luke. Mark's account, Mark was not there, but we know very early in history that Mark is writing for Peter while Peter's in Rome. I think there's a ton of evidence. I'm working on that as my next book. There's a ton of evidence in the Gospel of Mark that points that Peter is the source for that. Peter is the eyewitness. Mark is simply the scribe. So you've got 4 documents that contain eyewitness accounts. Start measuring those and start taking a look at those. And how do you measure them? Well, number one, were they written early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses? Because one of the claims I would have made as a skeptic was these are probably really late in history. Because if you want to lie about Jesus, you simply wait till everyone who knows the truth is dead. Then you can say whatever you want about Jesus. So my suspicion was these are probably written very late in history. 2, you got to ask the question, does anything corroborate this? Look, there's another worldview out there that mentions Jesus. It's called Mormonism, and it makes a claim about history on the North American continent in a book called the Book of Mormon. Yet you could never corroborate any of these claims because none of those cities mentioned in that book ever existed on the North American continent. There are many ways you could actually look to see if these events could have happened in the first century in the locations that are described in the Gospels, in the New Testament, of Christian New Testament. And I think that's the second step. How do we corroborate something from the outside in and from the inside out? Third, have they changed over time? You can actually trace the claims about Jesus through the centuries to see if there's a simpler story about Jesus early in history that is then somehow multiplied and exaggerated until the Jesus of Nazareth becomes the Christ of Christianity. I needed to know, was the story exaggerated? And finally, ask yourself, why would they lie? Now look, people lie all the time, and they only lie for 3 reasons. The same 3 reasons why anyone commits a murder. It's always sex, money, and power. That's it. There's no 4th reason. Crazy is not a reason. If you're going to be declared criminally insane, I can't prosecute you. If you're going to be prosecutable, you're lying for one of these 3 reasons, and any other reason is a subset of one of those 3. Well, that helps us because if the disciples are lying about the Jesus story, what is in it for them? We know it has to be in one of those 3 areas: sex, money, or power. What are they getting out of this? Now, look. Lots of people will lie for what they don't know, or they'll die, rather, for what they don't know is a lie. They will give their lives to it. They'll fly planes into buildings over it. They don't know it's a lie. They weren't there. But this is the one group that would know if it's a lie, and yet they chose to die for their claims rather than make a change in the claims. Now, so I just needed to assess those 4 areas. So what are they getting out of that? Why are they dying for these claims? Because they're getting money? They're getting girlfriends? They're getting powerful? Apparently not powerful enough to stop their own murder. So the point I'm trying to make is you have to, like, just think about it as if it's a criminal case. Think about it as if it's somebody making a claim for you. On any other, you're going to measure every other claim using a set of rational principles. The same thing you would do if you were on a jury and I was asking you to assess. Let's put it this way. This might be a good way to kind of summarize this. I ask jurors all the time, are you the kind of person, before I impanel you, are you the kind of person who can make a decision even though you have open questions? If they tell me, no, I can't do that. If I have an unanswered question, I probably couldn't make a decision. Well, then you're going to be excused because I've never been able to answer every possible question for any juror because there's lots of things I don't know. I don't know how or why he did it. I just know that he did it. I often don't know why he did it unless he confesses. So you're going to have to be able to make a decision without answering I'm going to tell you everything you need to know, not everything that could be known. I'm going to walk you toward this suspect, but there's going to be a gap at the end of the evidence trail. I'm going to ask you at the end of that evidence trail, do you have enough information? You will. It's pointing right to him, not to anybody else. It's a small step to render the verdict. Well, the same thing is happening here. The evidence for Jesus points right to him. It's not going to answer every question you have. And you're going to have to take a step across your unanswered questions, the same as you would in a criminal trial. And that step is not unreasonable. It's based on the evidence. It's not blind. It's leading right to where you think it's going. And you're just going to have to step across your unanswered questions. And you do that already, every single day. You start your car. You don't even know how it operates. You put a key in the lock at your front door. You don't know precisely how locks operate. You just know that if I do this, I've got more than enough reason to expect a certain result. And this is how we operate in the world. The same thing could be applied to your Christian faith.
As we think about that sort of second group too, Jim, and I mentioned earlier on, I've got Cold Case Christianity by my bedside, and I've been reading that through, and it is a great tool bag, I suppose, to work through how do I best, as somebody who maybe says, well, I do believe in Jesus, I do have that faith, I want to be able to best express this. And perhaps maybe the church hasn't done a great job of recent years tooling up around the evidential understanding of Jesus for those to actually go and share their faith. How do you speak to that group of people and say, look, what is the best things to actually prepare yourself to talk with it? Because I think sometimes people think, I'm supposed to be on the street corner and shout at people and this is what it is. But the actual best way is to actually help somebody as they step towards faith.
Well, so let me just say something that's probably Look, I was not a part of the church and never stepped foot in a church and don't really understand sometimes why we do church the way we do it. But I think what we should recognize that if the entry point, if the criteria for entering the church is that you're going to have an emotional experience of some sort, then don't be surprised when everyone who's in the club is not equipped to defend it based on evidence. That was never the way we entered. If we're going to be a group that says the way in is through an experience, then get ready, because lots of people have experiences. Pretty much everyone has an experience. Mormonism is filled with people who have an experience, but cannot make an evidential case for what they believe. We have to do a better job coming in. Now, here's what I would say. It turns out that most of us are already committed to deep evidential thinking on any number of other things. So here in America, we have American football. And if you're like me, you're probably part of a fantasy football team. That means you're crafting your team every week based on the evidence of who's playing well, who's going to play best next week, who's injured, who might get injured, blah, 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 blah. You are making a case every day for your lineup. And I know people who can do a better job of making a case for their fantasy football team than they can for their faith, because they're so geeked out on it. That's all they think about. They read articles. They're on the news all the time. They've got all the bookmarks on their browsers for all of the fantasy football websites. Whatever it is you're geeked out about, you are going to take the time to be able to make a case for it. If that's your job and you've had to master a certain position at your job, you're thinking quite evidentially about how to do that at work. And so we have the capacity to do it. I think the problem is we're not as interested. I'll just be honest with you. I think this is something that we put on our Christian faith like a pair of socks we can change tomorrow. It's not in our core. It's not the thing we are so geeked out about, that we are so desperately interested in, that our kids just caught it from us because that's all we ever talked about. Your kids, if here in America, if you're a certain football team in your region, Your kids are probably the fan of that team too, because that's all they heard you talk about. You took them to all the games. You watched it on TV every weekend. It was exciting. You were excited about it. It was a point of interest that you shared. And then it turns out we raise up critically thinking fans who know who got drafted last year, know who they want to draft next year. They know the stats on that guy. They know everything about him. Yet they cannot answer the most basic questions about their Christian faith, because they never took that kind of geeked out, passionate approach to what they believed about God. But they certainly took that geeked out, passionate approach to what they believed about their favorite quarterback. So there's the problem, is that it's, to be honest, most of the time, it's about misplaced devotion. Look, everyone worships, whether you are a Christian or a non-Christian. What I mean is, everyone thinks that something is so important that you're willing to give it your time, your attention, your devotion. You're willing to form your identity around it. It's your work, it's your achievements, it's your love life, it's whatever it may be. There's something you think is more important than anything else. Well, in the end, whatever it is that you are primarily devoted to, it will enslave you. It will own you. You'll find your greatest joy there, but you'll also find your greatest disappointment there. Because at some point, all of these things that we chase this deeply fail us. And then we're left wondering, why do we spend so much time in that? So I think in the end, we have to. It's all about, what is it that you are so devoted to that you are willing to identify with it, shape your life around it, make all your decisions through it. Everyone can say there's something like that for them, whether you're an atheist or whether you're a theist. But if you are a theist, if you are a Christian, well, then why aren't you this sold out about your worldview? So that no one's going to surprise you with some question. No one's going to surprise you with some detail from the Christian past, whether it's ugly or beautiful, because you're so geeked out on it that you've already been there, done that. So I think in the end, we have to have that level of interest in and let's face it, we haven't catechized people well. We don't, what I mean by catechize, we haven't brought people in this way through this evidential door. So why are we then disappointed that nobody can talk about it evidentially? Well, then how about we start that way?
Jim, I literally could talk to you for hours. That's unfair to you because you've agreed to give us the time that you have. I am so thankful for the remarkable work that you are doing, that you are having these conversations, you are having these challenges to those of us who would say, yes, we are believers in Jesus, in what it is. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the work that you are doing and for the inspiration and the encouragement that you've given us today.
No, thanks, brother, for the opportunity to talk to you. Anytime, I'd be happy to do it again.
J. Warner Wallace from Cold Case Christianity does podcasts. There's a whole host of books that he's been involved in as well. It's been a pleasure to have him on Towards Understanding.